Well, today we start off with preferences. Now, what exactly is the preferences API? Now, preference API, it deals with the choice taken by a user that we can use to save through the preference API and restore the value whenever the application restarts or whenever we come up with the application again. Now, for example, if it is a newsletter app that shows news regarding various technologies, then we can give a user the choice to set the technology he wants the news, and then secondly he can choose the number of items or the number of news he wants to see on the main page. So that is the kind of preferences we can allow the user to set, and the values they get stored through the preference API, and when the application whenever it comes up, the values are again restored, and user can again change the values as required. So this entire selection of values, saving of values and restoring of values, there is an entire system setup which we call as the preferences API. So we'll set up first a simple preference file to see how we can take values from the user, and then we'll see how we save the values and how we can get the values and use those values. So the basic part in this is we need to set up a preference file. Now that file needs to be set up in the XML file, so in the XML folder. So I'll just go to my XML folder, create a new file. Now I'll say suppose we'll name this as first pref. So this is my first preference file. Now the resource type in this case is a preference. So I'll select a preference, and as you can see, the top level tag in this case will be a preference screen. So in this case we have inbuilt preferences that we can use. One is the checkbox preference, where we have a checkbox which we can toggle between on and off. We have an edit text preference where we can enter some value and that can be saved. Then we have a list preference where we have a list of values from which we can select, and then we can put out different elements within the same preference screen also. So this preference category, we can group a set of elements under a category, and then we can that will show up as a single unit. So I'll just start off with this. And as you can see, we have a starting tag which is the preference screen. Also we can see the XML file, we have a preference screen. Now within the preference screen, I'll just add a category. I'll say preference category. And now to this preference category, I'll say a checkbox. And I'll add another checkbox. And then I'll add another preference category to this, and to this preference category I'll add edit preference. Now there is also a inbuilt ringtone preference activity that is set up. So I'll take up another category and I'll add a ringtone category to this preference to this. So we'll set up the main layout of our preference screen. We have the main screen which has 3 categories, and then in each category we have some preferences lined up. I have 2 checkboxes here, I have an edit preference here and a ringtone preference. So I'll just set up the attributes for all these preferences. Now for the first preference category, I'll set up some title. I'll say select your I'll say technology. And in the checkbox preference, I'll say Android key. Now this is the ID for this checkbox preference, and we can obtain the value that we have for this preference against this key. So I'll say tech key. So whenever I need to find out suppose I'll say this as Java key, tech Java. Right. So whenever I need to get what value the user has set up against this checkbox preference, I can obtain against this key, which is tech Java. Then I can set up some title, Java news, and then you can add some summary to this. I can say here you see Java news, and similarly I can set up my checkbox preference for some other technology. I'll say PHP, tech PHP, and then I can say Android title PHP news, and you can have a summary. I can say here you see PHP news. So I've set up both the checkbox preferences within the preference category, which is selected knowledge, and then I can say Android title set the number of news, and then I get to this Android key is number key, and then I can set up the title. I'll say enter the number, and then I can have the summary. I can say this is the number of news, right? And then I can have a preference category for, I can say Android title select your ringtone, and within the ringtone preference again I can have Android key, ring key. I can have a title, say select your ringtone man, and I can have Android summary, and I can say choose a good one, right? So we're all set up. I set up a preference file that has we have more or less used all the preferences that we have except for the list preference. This is because we'll be taking up the list preference in a separate program. Now this has a category, two checkbox preferences, and I can give a default value to any preference. I can say default value, I can say true. So I'll let this be enabled by default, the Java news, and in case I don't want Java news, I want PHP news, I can just switch this off and turn this on. So this all set up for the preference file, and now I need to create an activity to show up this preference file, and I'll create a new activity. I'll create a new class, name this class, I say first ref activity. So this will not extend activity, rather this will extend another class which is preference activity, which is especially for preferences. So I import the preference activity. I start off with the onCreate method, onCreate, and I'll call up a method which is add preferences from resource. Now what this will do is this will load up all the preferences from the XML file and show up in a screen from where we can select the values. So I have r.xml my file is first pref. So I'm not seeing it here because I'll just clean up the project. And now I'm seeing this first pref. So this is all done up, and now I'll create up my main activity class. I'll say pref activity. Now I'll extend activity. Now I need to have some event on which I can load or show this screen. So I'll just have a simple button in the XML file for this activity. I'll create a small layout file. I'll have first pref. So I'll just have a simple button. I'll say show preferences. And I'll set up a method on click show prefs and complete this. Now here I'll again set up the on create. So I'll set up the set content view, which is r dot layout dot first pref. Just clean this off. So we have set the content view. Okay, and I'll have show prefs with a view. Right. So what I'll do is I'll also have a text field here where we can show what values have been taken up or set up by the user. So I'll just add a text field to this. Yeah. So we have a text field and we have this, right. So what I'll do is I have a simple intent this, and I have which is first pref activity dot class. Now this is the class that I have made that loads the preferences from the XML file. Yeah, and I'll start up the activity for result. I'll say intent I and request code I'll say 0. So I'll start up an activity for result so that we come back to this page and I can then show up the result in a text field. I'll just load the object of the text field. Find view by ID. I have added text 1. So I'll just check up edit text 1. Yeah. So I've set up the text field. I have the button setup and I just need to implement the on activity result method. Just take up from this. On activity result. So now when we save all the preferences, the system creates a name on its own by naming a file as per the package and the class name. So it will, as we have this class name as com.example.pref, so it will name this as package underscore preferences. So com.example.pref underscore preferences will be the name of the file that would be created by default, and I can put down the name of the file, or I can get a reference to that file through shared preferences. sp is equal to preference manager dot get default shared preference, and this is the context. So by default there is only one file that is created. There is one default name with which that file is created, and through this method get default shared preferences we get a reference to that file. So now I can use all the keys I have set up in this file. I have a key which is tech Java, then tech PHP. So I'll just start up my emulator also. So I'll start up my emulator, and now so I've got my emulator. This goes. Now first value I have a boolean. I'll say Java is equal to sp dot get boolean. Now the key was tech Java, and this is if in case I need to set up any default value, I can set up as say false. Now in all preference values we can set up a default value. I have only set up the default value in case of a checkbox, whereas we can set up the default value for all the preference. I can set up a default value in the edit text, I can set up a default value for the ringtone, I can set up a default value for the PHP check preference. Yeah, and then I'll check up PHP. I'll say sp dot get boolean tech PHP, and I'll by default again say false, and then I'll take up the value of the edit text. The key is no key. Okay, so I'll have a string no key, and default value I can say is no value entered. So again for the ringtone, can again take a string. What is the name of the preference? The name is ring key. So I'll say ring key and put on a default value, say no ringtone selected. So we obtained all the values of the preferences that we have set through the screen, and then I can set up on the et.setText. Let me first arrange the values. Suppose I'll say string message. Now I'll say technology chosen is, and now I'll say if Java, then I'll say mess plus equal to Java. Even though we can have both of them selected, and then I can add to this, and we can say if PHP mess plus equal to PHP The only problem is in because we haven't set up properly, I can these two values will come together. There is no, I can just put a comma here to separate the values. Okay, right. So and then we can check up technology chosen is this, and then we can have the number. Number of news is K. I've added that, and then we'll add the ringtone. Simply say ringtone is plus ring, and to this we'll set up this message. So this finishes everything. Now first of all, I have just set up the button and the text field screen as the layout. We obtain the edit text object, then we have pressed the button. On click we have an intent, and then we come up back with the start activity for result. Now as soon as we set up the values, we'll dispose of the activities preference screen. We come up back to this method where we obtain a default shared preference object from which we can get all the values that we have set up through the preference screen, and we can show up with the edit text. Right. So we'll just start up. I'll just add the values to the manifest file. Yeah, we have two activities to add up. One is the pref activity and one is the first pref activity. So this is pref activity, which is the main activity, and the second is the first pref activity. Done this, I'll just save this file, and then I'll run this in the emulator. Yeah. So even though we have a special activity devoted to showing the preference screen, we can have an options menu item which can be used to show up the preference screen, because this is where the main utility of setting the preferences is. We don't need to have a altogether separate activity to show the preferences. We can simply have a menu option which can show up the preferences screen. So now this is, as you can see, select your technology. This is one category. Then we have set the number of news. This is another category, and this is select your ringtone is the third category. So for every category we have a divider so that we can have a distinction between different categories of preferences. Now this is as per the default value of true. I can switch this off and enable this. Then I can enter the number. Now I can enter say 10. So this is my edit, and then I can set my ringtone. Now because this is an emulator, we won't be seeing a number of choices for the ringtone, but in case you run it on your own mobile, you'll have a number of ringtones that will come up, and you can have a selection of the ringtone depending upon your choice. So I'll just say default ringtone. This is okay, and I'll just move the screen off so that we can come back to our original screen and see what values have been selected. Now as you can see, the technology chosen is PHP, the number of news are 10, and the ringtone is, this is what comes corresponding to the our default ringtone. Now what happens in this case is, now I'll go to the I'll go to the DDMS so that we can see where the file is and what exactly the file contains. I'll go to the File Explorer. There's a data folder. Within the data folder, there's another data folder. We have a folder corresponding to our package, which is com.example.pref. I have a shared prefs folder. And as you can see, I have a preferences file which is com.example.pref_preferences. Now this is what I told you, that it creates by default a preference file corresponding to the name of the package, because this is shared between all the activities within the same application. So this is as per the package_preferences, but we are not limited to using the name that's set up by the system. We can provide any name to this file, as we will see subsequently. Now I can pull this file from the system. I can take up and say if just open up my F drive. Now this is the file. I'll just open up. This opens up in my Dreamweaver, and this is it. Yeah. Now as you can see, it has a map of values with a key and a content. So we have a string name equal to no key and a value. We have a boolean name is equal to TextJava and a value. So this is how it is saving the preferences, and whenever the system loads up, it pulls up the preferences value from this file, and accordingly the user can be shown the application as per the choice of preferences. So this starts up our preference chapter. Now in the first, we have seen the simple setting up, how we set up a preference file, how we set up a preference screen, various preferences that we have already inbuilt for usage, and how we can get the values of the preference values that we have set.